continent is viewed in the world, by potential investors, but above all, by ourselves. The same is true of our literature, our music, our fashion. The question is, who funds these projects? I find the story of Y Tu Mamá También so instructive because it required the vision of a single Mexican business person, not the Mexican government, and not, importantly, an American production company. And so number two, that movie raises the question for me, where are the African investors? Where is the African equivalent of the Jorge Vergara, who single-handedly, with one investment, launched the new wave of Mexican cinema? Where are the African private sector pioneers willing to invest in African CCI, to put up the money for higher budget features, to finance literature festivals, to invest in outlets of consumption? Y Tu Mamá También could make $2.5 million in its opening weekend, which is still a box office record for Mexico, because it was screened at 250 cinemas in Mexico. Where are those cinemas in Africa? Today there are 40,000 movie theaters in the United States, 20,000 in India, 13,000 in China, and our entire continent has fewer than 1,000. That's one cinema per million people. Where is the capital investment, not just in movies, but in movie theaters? Or, if you argue that the world is moving to streaming, the investment in reduced data costs, in bookstores. African consumers cannot do what our brother was talking about earlier, cannot participate in Afro-consumerism, they cannot access African content if they don't know where to find it. When I wrote my own novel, Ghana Must Go, I was most excited of my entire global tour about launching that book in Ghana. But there was no bookstore at the time, which was 2014, that would partner with my publisher on the launch. One bookstore left the books at the port, unwilling to pay customs charges. Another didn't have sufficient funding to place a minimum order. My mother actually ended up ordering the books through her pediatric practice. We hauled the boxes to each event, and all of them sold out. This wasn't a question, I don't think, of the quality of the book, but the access of the consumers. Where are the public grants for the creation of libraries, bookstores, independent cinemas, low-cost Wi-Fi? These are not rhetorical questions. The third thing I think we can learn from that Mexican movie is this: creatives leave the country when they don't have sufficient support. All the way back in 2003, that same Mexican director lamented, quote, "What is ironic is at a time when there's all this attention being paid to Mexican cinema, the Mexican government won't support the institutions that support it." That was 2003. Last year, that same director won an Academy Award, but he doesn't live in Mexico anymore. Without support from his government, he left, taking a whole wave of Mexican directors with him, and we're watching the same, we risk the same happening on this continent if we don't change our perspective. Are we making the same mistake? Our musicians, our fashion designers, our novelists, our filmmakers have never been in greater global demand. Are we creating a culture on the continent that supports their work? Their work is making money. This isn't a question of charity, but of clarity. We need clarity about the size of the opportunity in dollar terms and the value of the work in cultural ones. So the money. I know that business people like money. It turns out politicians like money too. And creatives definitely need it. So let's look at the money. Music. In Nigeria, the music industry alone is expected to double by next year, reaching $86 million in revenue. South Africa's total music revenue is set to reach $178 million by the end of next year, with the music economy specifically enjoying annual growth of 4.4%, fueled by surging digital streaming revenues. Kenya's total music industry revenue is expected to rise from $22 million in 2017 to $32 million in 2021. That's real money. In film, you may have heard the Nollywood numbers. Nigerian film production generates between $500 million and $800 million annually, with the industry directly employing 300,000 people and indirectly employing more than a million Nigerian citizens employed through Nollywood. And books. my favorite. African and diasporan bestsellers like Americana, Stay With Me, We Need New Names, Children of Blood and Bone have generated millions in global sales, to say nothing of film adaptation revenue. This is real money. Let's be clear. But let's be conscious, too. Cash cannot be the only reason to invest in African CCI, in African creative economy, because revenue is not creative work's only return. Europe knows this. Back in the 90s, when talks at the World Trade Organization turned to CCI, the United States, as it is wont, urged the unrestricted opening of markets to creative goods and services. A number of European countries said no. They said, plainly, that they feared being swamped by films and television products from Hollywood that would obliterate their own audiovisual industries, but more importantly, spread American values and worldviews to their consumers. It was in this context that the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions was adopted as a legal instrument, granting governments the right to invest in and, most importantly, protect their CCI without such protections qualifying as unfair intervention in free trade. What those countries knew, and what this continent must remember, is that the creative and cultural industries are not just a source of capital, they are not just a source of revenue, but they are key bearers of traditions, moral values, worldviews, ideological assumptions, and ideas. The Burial of Kojo is more than just a beautiful Ghanaian film. It is an expression of the beauty of Ghanaian values. We Need New Names is more than a brilliant book by a Zimbabwean author. It is a searing account of Zimbabwe's recent history. Nollywood doesn't just create jobs in Nigeria, it creates pride in Nigeria, sharing Nigerian stories in all of their craziness with the world. Fashion brands like Makosa, Studio 189, and Kenya's IMI sustain a multiplicity of traditional printmaking and jewelry making practices. That these brands are selling well is wonderful. That these practices are being sustained is critical. This is our heritage. Our culture is our heritage. To return and to end with my love of definitions. Heritage is defined simply as property that is or may be inherited. Our CCI, our cultural and creative products, are our property. Our children, our culture, our continent will inherit this property as we have inherited it from generations before us, but only and most powerfully if we recognize its value, if we invest in our property as both public and private actors, if we create legal frameworks around intellectual property, if we support the architects of this property and recognize their worth, a world of wealth, of financial, cultural, and communal empowerment awaits us.
So you heard that call to action there, and I hope everybody is taking heed. We're now going to open the discussion up for the rest of the panel. Mr. Lustio's translator is here. She speaks Portuguese, so we'll be incorporating this into our panel today. I do want to start first with this idea of where and how the shaping of the African narrative begins. And I'm going to first start that with Ms. Shonyeyin, please.
Good evening, everyone. So, I have a success story that I think I should tell. 7 years ago, I founded the Ake Arts and Book Festival, and we were able to have a successful festival because we got a $200,000 grant from the World Bank. And after we'd spent it all, the second year, it was a question of, okay, so where do we go now to get the money? So we did the rounds, the British Council, the French Cultural Institute, Goethe Institute, went to all these places and got little bits and bobs. But then it really started to bother me that when I'm standing there doing my welcome address, I'd be speaking to an African audience, but when the time came for me to thank the sponsors, it was all these foreign organizations. So I said to myself, I'm going to look for the money for Ake Festival in Nigeria. And I made that my goal. And it was very difficult, but 3 years ago, I came across the MD CEO of a bank in Nigeria called Sterling, and I told him about my vision, and he bought into it. And for the last 3 years, they have been the primary funder of Ake Arts and Book Festival. So I can say, thank you, with confidence that it's truly an African festival. And to talk very briefly, refer to what Tai said about our stories. The times that I have gone to companies and they've nodded very politely before asking me to leave, the problem has always been with them understanding the significance of our stories. In many African societies, of course, we're natural storytellers. And colonialism has come and gone, but that's another talk show. So whatever they've left behind, we're now having to work with. And for many of us, Yvonne is here, Tai is here, I'm here, we're novelists whose works have been published abroad. And for me, those stories, we're using what they left, though. We will bend it and twist it and use it to say what we want to say and how we want to say it. But these stories are there for posterity. And in every single way, these stories are our heritage. So why not support storytellers? Why not support an event that brings together over 100 writers, filmmakers, poets, dancers from Africa, from the African diaspora? Why not support a truly Pan-African festival? That, for me, is changing the narrative. I'm not so interested anymore in the Western gaze, in what they think about our stories. In fact, what's important for me now is for Africans to appreciate African stories. And that comes from, we're in the age now, yes, there's technology, but for goodness sake, we really have to do everything we can to ensure that our children can read these stories. So I'm very focused on that. Thank you.
Now, I want to turn to Ms. DK now because you connect African contemporary art and artists with the global marketplace. So do you think that African consumers value, support, and purchase from homegrown talent in the same way that outside buyers do? And if not, why do you think that is?
Well, good evening all. I would actually like to thank the UNDP for including the creative industries as part of their program, and most importantly, to talk about our contemporary art, because we already know what the contribution of the film industry, the music industries, and the fashion as well doing, but not the contribution of our contemporary art sector. Mr. Batali actually mentioned earlier, he talked about fashion and our regional tourism, but what he didn't realize was that in March this year, you had 30,000 visitors to Bamako Photography Biennale. This was made up of at least half the people from all over the world were to see the photography exhibitions and fairs there. The Dakar Biennale started nearly 30 years ago today. Today, they command at least 40,000 people every 2 years going to Senegal. Just imagine what that does to tourism. And if you're talking about the SDGs, this is how the contemporary art sector contributes to that strategy. I think for me, charity begins at home. And I think we must start locally. We need to start educating our own people of the value of our art and culture. We have to create systems. At the moment, we have this traditional formats, Euro-American made, and we're applying the same traditional formats in the way we design our own sort of art projects, which doesn't really make sense, because what we need to do is design something that makes sense to us locally, that we can share with our regional brothers and sisters. And I bet you the global world will come because they find you. They smell success from afar, and you don't have to invite them, they will come. And so if we want to see the global success we're talking about today, we need to start from home. Ella Natsue has never left this continent, but to date his art has made about 17 to 18 million euros. And he is in Nsukka, Nigeria. I know he's Ghanaian, but I will claim him because he's been in Nigeria for nearly 50 years. Now, in his community, in his locality, this man actually employs the locals, community people, to help him out in his studio. Just imagine removing that from that community. We don't understand the the contribution of artists in terms of their economic development of their various localities and communities, and we need to start, sort of educating our locals about that. I'll stop here for now.
And to that point, we have this idea that when it comes to a lot of the traditional cultural art, it tends to be in the informal sector. People perhaps don't value it the way that they should, and then when it goes to sell abroad, all of a sudden the prices are sky high, and we're wondering why on the continent we don't share that same appreciation. Ms. Anand, I want to talk to you now, because a lot of people are wondering what sort of protections or platforms are really needed to allow creatives to work and support themselves financially, but still have their work protected.
Thank you. And again, thank you, UNDP, for organizing such a panel, because I believe the creative economy is so important. When you talk about CCI, or what I call the orange economy, is very much tied into our development, and it's a way to promote inclusive development and tying into supporting the youth and women. So when it comes to creatives, I always say, because I come in from a different perspective, which is financing creatives. And I've been doing this through the African Fashion Fund, and also raising a 100 million euro fund that is going to be supporting African creatives. And the challenge in positioning creatives for financing is that creativity itself as an asset class is not one that people look at as an investable asset class. So, just alluding to some of the statements that you made earlier, which is positioning these artists who are making millions of dollars from an investor's perspective. When they look at creativity, it's a wide spectrum, right? So it goes from music, film, fashion, contemporary art, architecture. So it's hard to quantify because there's so many dynamics in one sector. So that is in itself is a challenge. So what we are trying to do is to help people understand the investment potential in this. One of the key things to mention here is that when the world was going through economic crisis in 2008, the creative sector still thrived, just because of how versatile it is as a sector. It also created the most jobs, and it made the most revenue. So they are robust when it comes to looking at the robust nature of the creative sector. That's something that we can never discount. We are looking at a way in which we are finding measures to quantify what's this asset class can actually present. And I'll tell you one way that we're looking at this. We're looking at a blended finance approach. We believe that there has to be some money that comes in from grants that is going to be used to de-risk the investment that can come in from private capital. We need to work with development finance institutions. We need to have governments also support. This is the only way that you can create this asset class as something that is investable, because I'm not sure if you know this, but recently there was an initiative launched at the European Commission called Creatify. And Creatify is a 20 million fund of funds, which is a blended finance approach, which is the European Commission committing guarantee instruments and also mobilizing private capital through pillar assess organizations. And we've been working with them on this process. And we understand the challenges, involved in, because when you're saying transporting your work from here to the global market, or being able to put measures in place like intellectual property to make sure that creative work is actually commercially viable, because without IP, there's no commercial viability, so it's difficult to actually make that return on investment. Because typical investors that come in here are thinking it's either private equity, which is I'm here for 8 years, I'm putting my money into agriculture, real estate, or energy, but I can realize that investment after 3 years and I have my exit strategy. In creatives, it's very different, because if you're looking at the creators themselves, they're very passionate about their work, and it's a very long-term thing, which requires a lot of patient capital. Who has that patient capital to commit? You have to most creatives put in their own money, and I'm sure many of you can attest to that. But how can you convince somebody who wants to put $10 million and make $15 million out in 8 years to put that money into this asset class? So we need to look at all of these challenges and see how we can commercialize, number one, quantify, add points which really focus more on development, so women's empowerment, because the creative sector employs more women, and we need to support women, because when we educate and empower women economically, they in turn empower their communities. So that is a point that we need to project. Youth, we have a demographic issue on the continent. 65% of our population are under the age of 25. Most of the creative jobs are occupied by youth, right? So we need to find a way to be able to empower them so that they don't have that incentive to actually leave the continent and go somewhere else to seek greener pastures. They need to be empowered locally. So these are the things that we need to bring together and create that story to attract more investments, and to be able to also accept our own creations and make sure that we protect it with the right IP and policies so that we can also benefit from it economically.
So, Mr. Lustio, obviously there are more than 50 countries across the African continent, countless languages. When it comes to especially written work, what needs to happen to really break down some of the cultural and linguistic barriers for writers so that their work can be enjoyed more widely?
Boa tarde. Agradeço o diretor regional do UNDP África pelo convite para eu estar aqui presente.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank you, the UNDP Regional Director, for this invitation to participate in this event.
Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, estamos quase no final do primeiro quarto do século XXI e estamos a ser convocados para escrever sobre a nossa história e sobre as nossas histórias, na perspectiva de construir um futuro do nosso continente, futuro para além da ajuda.
We are in the 21st century. We are called to write about our history, stories, to build the future of our continent, a future beyond it.
Interpreto o desafio como é tempo para nós africanos nos assumirmos como os responsáveis pelo que acontece com as nossas populações, as nossas terras, os nossos recursos.
I interpret the challenge as it's time for us as Africans to assume as responsible for what happened with our population, our land, and our resource.
Tempo para os escritores, certamente difícil de escrever e de ser lido, porque vamos escrever sobre nós, sobre comportamentos, preconceitos, ambições, às vezes desmedidas. Vamos escrever sobre fracassos, sobre fragilidades, sobre crimes, sobre vidas. Mas também vamos falar de vitórias, de sucessos, de música, de vontade de viver.
A time for us as writers, of course, it's difficult to write and to be read, because we're going to write about ourselves, our behaviors, prejudice, ambitions, sometimes exaggerate. We'll talk about our failures, fragilities, crimes, and lives, but also about our victories, success, music, happiness, our willingness to live. We're going to talk about our countries, our youth especially.
E a propósito, lembro aqui um facto que se passou poucos anos depois da independência do meu país, Cabo Verde. Nós continuávamos a atribuir as culpas de todos os nossos fracassos, de tudo que corria mal, ao antigo regime colonial português.
I want to share something that happened in my few years after the independence of my country, Cabo Verde. We were used to blame the Portuguese colonial regime for our failures, for everything that was wrong in our country, to the colonial Portuguese regime.
Até que um dia um governante nos disse: vocês não acham que já é tempo de nós mesmos ser responsáveis também por nossos erros, pelas coisas mal feitas que nós fazemos?
Until a day that a government minister told us, don't you think it is time for us to assume and be responsible for our failures, for everything that's going wrong in our country, our mistakes?
Como é possível que um buraco na rua onde moras seja da responsabilidade do governo colonial que partiu há 9 anos? Foste tu que não tapaste o buraco da rua onde moras.
How come a hole in our street, in the street where you live, is the responsibility of a colonial regime that left 9 years ago? It's your responsibility.
Foi com esta lição, eu penso, que começou a minha noção de independência total.
It was with this lesson that this lesson has enabled me to understand the notion of total independence.
Como é que nós, mulheres e homens, escritores, podemos participar deste desafio? Que histórias temos para contar?
How women and men, writers, can participate in this challenge. What stories that we have to be, or are stories to be told.
Eu, quando escrevo, há 2 marcas que faço questão de ilustrar a minha escrita: ser mulher e ser africana.
When I write, there are 2 aspects I like to illustrate: being women, being African.
defino-me como mulher, não por ter nascido menina, mas porque me identifico com as causas e lutas que defendem a dignidade, o empoderamento e a liberdade da mulher.
I define myself as a woman not because I was born as a female, but because I identify myself with the cause and the strength and the struggle to protect my dignity, equity, empowerment, and women freedom.
Devido ao tempo limitado, vou concluir.
Due to time constraints, I would like to conclude.
E para terminar, eu quero dizer que não é fácil contarmos histórias de algumas regiões da nossa querida África.
To conclude, I would like to say it's not easy to tell the stories of some part of Africa.
Estou a referir-me à prática da mutilação genital das nossas meninas.
I'm referring to the genital mutilation of our girls.
E por isso convocamos mulheres, homens, pais e irmãos para pararmos um minuto que seja para pensarmos no sofrimento das meninas atiradas para o chão, expostas, abertas aos olhares dos outros.
We call men, women, fathers, brothers in our continent to stop, to reflect for a minute, to understand the suffering, the pain of our girls. Throw to the floor, bed, exposed, and open to the eyes of others to be cut, to bleed, and swing with a needle in the middle of screams and the tears.
Não queremos mais histórias dessas para contar.
We don't want the stories to be told.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
As we heard from Ms. Salustio there, a lot of the stories, very hard to tell, and modems like art give people a very unique way to tell their stories, often in a way that traditional mediums don't. I want to bring in Ms. Salasi. What is it that you think that the arts bring to the table in terms of that value that you just can't find anywhere else?
What do the arts bring to the table that we can't find anywhere else?
Like in terms of the sort of the nuance of culture and storytelling it's not so easily perceived until it's something that's in the written word or in art.
Absolutely. Well, it speaks to what Lola has said and what Roberta said, what in fact all my colleagues have said, which is art has a value beyond the return on investment, beyond those many millions that our Ghanaian Nigerian brother has made, beyond the money that has been put into Ake and the joy that has come out of it. The value, the unique gift that I think art brings into our culture is twofold. First, it gives us a way to reflect on who we are as individuals and as communities. And it gives us, one of my editors once said, we write books to express something, but we read them to learn how to live. We create art to express something that will exist long after we're gone and that will remain in conversation with the generations before us and those that come after. And so artistic products, if we want to call them that, participate in this continuum of reflection and expression that is unique in the history of the world. If I, as a Ghanaian, Nigerian, whatever else I am, creative, want to know how to tell my story, I look to Yoruba fables. I look to Ewe drumming patterns for an understanding of how those before me have expressed themselves, and I incorporate those traditions and that learning into my own contemporary, and in my case, sort of hybrid way of seeing, way of being. But I leave that then for the next who are coming. And I think if we take our eye off of that, and if we focus too narrowly on the commercial value, we can overlook the cultural one. And I, as you can probably hear from my very strange accent, I grew up in the United States. This is a young country, let me put it like that, that knows this, that has told its entire national story, has whipped its entire populace into a frenzy about its national identity, primarily through storytelling, primarily through music and books and movies. It is an incredible feat to create an entire worldview out of a cinema industry. But I was educated in a country that did it, and I think we can use that power constructively and consciously on this continent to ask, as I've said, how do we participate in modes of reflection and expression that will outlive us and change who we are?
And to that point, I want to bring in Miss Gregory now, because we know films, especially, are one of those mediums that really allow you to reach a much wider audience in a very short span of time. But when you think of the narrative of African films, say even 10, 20 years ago, compared to now, you have obviously huge platforms like Netflix clamoring to find these African stories. What's driving that shift, and what do you think of their approach to how they're really reaching out to African storytellers?
Thank you. I think in terms of the platforms and how they're reaching out to the diaspora really and African stories, is that there are a lot of stories that are they cross boundaries culturally. Some stories are universal. I think what happens sometimes, people get bogged down with and putting people in a box. And, love is love, romance is romance, fear is fear. A smile, a laugh is universal. And I think that, that is allowing people to sort of look at our stories differently. I think the quality of our stories, the quality of film and television is like the Burla of Kojo and so on, and stories like that, whereby the method of storytelling is a lot stronger visually. The quality that's going into the work, the writing that's going into the work. And I think a lot of platforms and broadcasters are realizing that there are a lot of us out there. And it's, at the end of the day, they see it as a commercial commodity. Whereas us, we're looking at it as sharing our stories, telling our stories, because representation is important. As storytellers, it's all about representation and what the worldview is of us and how we see us. And the most important thing, I think, in terms of being able to tell our stories and own our stories is that, like she said, they will come. And we just need to keep telling our stories. And a lot of times doors are closed, especially as a filmmaker. They say, as a black filmmaker, your films don't sell. No one wants to see them. But the proof is in the pudding. The numbers are out there. And going back to us supporting each other and supporting, filmmakers and creatives in the diaspora as well, and finding investment from our own people, because what happens is that you do find sponsors and people willing to give us money, but what happens is they want us to change our story. They want to twist it. They want to bend it and sort of give it a different look and feel to make it sort of more, that what they say is palatable. And I think the message to take away from that is, is to really just keep plowing through and telling our own stories. And also my focus right now is children's stories, and educating children and children to be able to see themselves on screen. And that is really what's going to drive the narrative as well, and the stories that we want to tell and how we are perceived and how the world perceives us.
And I think that's a good point to bring in Miss Owo, because we know that in your TED Talk, Words for Worlds, you talked about how quickly the narrative about the entire content changed with the Ebola outbreak. Pretty much everything about Africa becoming a technology hub, and everything sort of went out of the window, and all of a sudden it became the Ebola continent. Talk to us a little bit about what you do when somebody else sort of grabs and twists your narrative, and the sort of impact that can have.
Well, thank you for the question, and a good evening to everybody. I'm grateful to the UNDP for bringing me here, but I'm not going to thank them for involving creatives. I'm assuming they did so because they understand the trends of the time, and so they are ahead. They're ahead of the curve, and the incorporation of creatives is not something exotic or new. So thank you for being there. Okay, what do you do? I'm thinking of an earlier question you asked, like where is the African narrative situated? In several places. In the imagination of an Occident that stuck something between the 14th and 18th century, so you find the repetition of tropes of the, the happy African that's constantly on the threat of eating another African. The narrative that shows up in all sorts of, not UNDP, development narratives. The child with the fly on the wall, the woman with the bare breast, the hunger, that particular image. So there's that story. There's this, and linked to that story is the story that's told also in the Western media. But there's the other story that is embedded in the places that we have kept away from ourselves, in the lives of the, I got very moved, very emotional when I saw the traditional leaders right here. I don't understand necessarily why, but it's, I think, the idea of a sense of perhaps the idea that the continuity that one thought was lost might still exist, that there's something that one can touch. But what's been lost in the years in between is the, if you want, the presence of the narrative of the life, of that particular life, of continuity. So there's that other African story that's buried and hidden and lost. The other stories and the stories that we are trying to tell as contemporary story makers, story creators, and artists, that's also in the world. So like I said, they're competing spaces for that particular narrative. You know, back to your question about the Ebola thing, there's very little we can do about what a group, a concentrated cultural space decides this is who you are, right? And like Lola says, I am through with trying to educate anybody's ignorance. I'm done. But what I focus my wrath and my rage on is the African space and the African people, us. The refusal to evolve our own mythologies, our contentment with the ridiculous myths about ourselves that have been perpetuated and sold to us, our repetition of that absolute bullshit in public spaces. Our refusal, I don't know why, I don't know if it's a laziness or a lack of imagination. The idea we prefer to reiterate or respond or defend that which somebody has said about us. There's a space of imagination, and this is not new. It's not the first time I'm saying this. There's a space of a terror of the unknown, and the African imagination is the unknown, certainly for us. And there's a terror, there seems to be a, I don't know, whether it's a psychic space, a terror of engaging with the possibility of who we can imagine ourselves to be. And it's important for me to mention that particular resistance, because unless we can dare to construct an imagination for ourselves in the world, for ourselves in the continent, and within that construction of the self, constructing a narrative of the world, daring to say this is how the world is in our imagination, unless we're able to do that, we will always strive for the minimum rather than strive for that which we have called forth for ourselves.
Would you like
just
to follow up?
wanted to add something to what Tai said, and of course what Yvonne has said about, you know, the role of the players within the cultural industry. And I'm very suspicious of politicians on the African continent. But I find that when we get together, when creatives get together, their conversations are truthful and meaningful. That's what I have discovered. So, in essence, we're also going to be looking at creativity for the truth. It is the last bastion of truth and hope for us on this continent.
Now, ladies, I would like to get each one of you to chime in terms of letting us know what your philosophy is about the role of the creative economy and the creative contributions of creatives on the continent in moving the continent beyond aid. How do we turn that into something that's shareable and enjoyable and that really still honors our stories? I'd like to start with you, Ms. Adnan, and we'll work our way around.
Thank you. I think, in fact, if we're going to move this continent beyond aid, and we are going to be regarded as a competitive player globally when it comes to having some economic power, it's a creative economy that's going to get us there. The reason why I say that is because Africa's biggest resource is this human resource. It's not what is on ground that can be depleted. There are many bright people here. There are many, I've dealt with creatives since I started my nonprofit since 2014. And I tell you, the opportunity here, we're only tapping into less than 10% of the opportunity. And we need to put our money, we need to put our minds together, government, private sector, civil society, and we really need to invest in this sector and really empower it, build the capacity so that it can really bring us the return on investment that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. I love what you said, Roberta. I love listening to what everyone has said, and I would add to that only this. It occurred to me when you were speaking. I was speaking yesterday with my father about aluminium, and he was lamenting, as many an African has and will in the years to come, that this Ghanaian company used to make a lot of the roofing, and now the imports are brought in from China and they've undercut the costs, and it's impossible for the Ghanaian manufacturer with the power outs to create the roofing that can compete with this low-cost Chinese roofing. And then he looked at me and he said, you know, it's funny, it occurs to me, Taye, that no Chinese person can ever write your story, can ever come in with a cheaper version of our narrative and undercut our creative content. It cannot happen. Nobody can write Yvonne's novels the way she wrote them. No one can write Lola's novels the way she writes them. Nobody can create the art of the visual artists that you're talking about, or the films that you're talking about, or os livros that you're talking about. Nobody can do that. This is the single piece of content that we own. And what I want to see, what I so desperately long to see, is what Lola mentioned with the beautiful example of Sterling Bank backing Ake. I want to see African investors empowering African creatives to own the entire infrastructure around that content. Not that we wait for Chinese companies to build the movie theaters, and we wait for with all due respect, development bodies to put in the money, but that we, with all the material wealth that we have in this continent, because of course our minds are our greatest resources, but there's also a lot of cash floating around. And I'd like to see that directed into the creative industries on the understanding that this is one place where we can compete, where we have always excelled, and where nobody can imitate what we do.
It's funny how when people talk about a future beyond aid, they also ask the same questions to the creative industries who have actually survived their past, present, and their future beyond aid. I think for this sector, we should cease seeking external validation. 7 years is a magical word because that's when I also started in this industry. And the reason why was because I was told that our art was never good enough. I wondered why I saw our African artists undervalued when they're better than their European counterparts. And I like testing hypotheses. So if you say that our artists are not good enough, you know, you can't sort of, you have to decide your worth, then let's do this differently. I decided I was going to set up an alternative platform to showcase our artists. And part of that was to create the blind portfolio. So if you say that your European artists are far better and the European collectors prefer the art from Europe, America, no problem. When I work with my clients now and they give me a list of artwork to source for them, what I do is I mix it up. I find those artists that they want. I go to marginalized artists, so African artists, Haitian artists, and artists from outside the catchment areas of art. I send this to them without name or geographical locations, just the image and the title. Well, 80% of the time, guess what? They choose those artists that they claim aren't good enough for them. And so if we're talking about a future beyond aid, I think we should stop seeking external validation and believe in our value and worth. It's a good way to start. Thank you.
Absolutely agree with you. I guess for generations, we've been on this continent sort of shamed into believing that what we produce, what we believe, what we worship, who we are, what we love is inferior. And related to what you were just saying, we have to make a concerted effort to set high standards, because it's too easy to go the easy route. And those standards will be set by conversations such as the one we're having now. Very, very critical.
About the post-aid future, I think it's already here. I know one of the elephants in the room has been the matter of China, frankly. What does it mean then to try to situate ourselves in the future, also as members of the heritage economy? And what role does the heritage economy play in terms of calling forth or bringing into life this particular future, and what would need to be done? Let me be crude. Netflix, $180 billion worth. That's very simple. That's as simple as it gets. When people talk about content is king, the world is, there's a global content hunger for content. And what is content? Mostly about story, whether it's in fashion or in film. It's about story. So, and as Ty pointed out a little earlier, we content creators, story makers, we are being sought, hunted down by global content platforms like the Netflixes of this world. The market, it's not about the market, it's already there. It's simply about this. If we want to be competitive, as a continent and as a people, if we intend to define the future, not just for the continent, but also for the world, we have to be ahead of the curve, but we also have to be where the game is being played, right? there's nothing exotic about that. And when I say I'm being crude about it, is since people are interested in money, this is where the money is, frankly. The first person, the first institution, the first group to set up an intra-African content accessible network that taps into the great youth dividend, but also maybe the older generation dividend that already exists, and concentrate spaces where stories and imagination is harnessed, is going to make a hell of a lot of money. And it simply comes down to that. It probably requires another kind of imagination to what do you call it? To structure a system, a platform, a method to draw on what already exists. People are talking about harnessing resources. The resources are here, are right here. How do you harness that? And if you're not going to harness it, I promise you, there are others who are going to harness it. The South Koreans, and they've done it very well. The Chinese, we're in talks with them. The Netflixes, the Apple TVs of this world, right? When we talk about it's the digital age, there's a whole democratization of the spaces. Part of that democratization of space means that organizations and corporations and institutions will look for sources of that which they need anywhere and everywhere in the world. Okay?
I think the call out is really Africa Beyond Aid, and the way to look to the future is about balancing the creative with the business. And going back to heritage, so you can't put a value on that. That's cultural currency. You just can't put a value on that. So if you look to the business side of things, and how do you build a business? It's through marketing, it's through branding, it's putting out that message. And that message, creatives, we do that day in, day out. It's about the stories. It's about storytelling and harnessing our stories, celebrating our stories, and also unifying us as Africans and Africans within the diaspora, and looking at, and sort of coming together, unified and not sort of in our own silos, like we talk about Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, etc. And it really is us coming together as a people and celebrating us and loving ourselves.
Eu prometo que vou treinar o meu inglês.
I promise to learn English and to practice.
You be you.
Nós, quando escrevemos África, quando falamos África do futuro, estamos a falar em desenvolvimento, em criatividade, em pessoas.
When we write about Africa, we talk about the creativity, we talk about people.
Lá fora falam da África como se fôssemos máscaras.
Outside, they talk about Africa as if we are mask.
Máscaras, mistérios e outros.
Mysteries and others.
Eu acho que nós, depois da ajuda, para o futuro, depois da ajuda, vamos ter que equacionar a palavra ajuda.
In the future, we need to talk about, the meaning of aid. What does it mean?
Porque a ajuda para nós, por exemplo, no meu país, a gente recebe muito bem, a gente vive à custa da ajuda, mas é sempre um favor que nos fazem.
In my country, we receive aid. We appreciate the aid because it's a contribution for development.
E eu acho que nós temos que, na nossa mentalidade, acabar com a ideia que ajuda é uma esmola, uma dádiva.
We needed to change the mindset. I think that the aid is about charity.
Ajuda é troca. Nós damos e recebemos.
Aid is about exchange. You give, I receive.
E eu penso que o futuro da África depois, para além da ajuda, vai ser um futuro melhor e vai ser um futuro com mais orgulho e tempo.
Africa without aid, it's about a good future. It's about the realization of our Africa pride.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
I think the very important point we all missed today is the importance of collaboration, local collaboration, regional collaboration. As according to Kwame Nkrumah, Africa must unite. And so,
We're stronger together.
Well, I would like to open the floor. We have a little bit of time for questions. If we're able to get a mic to this lady in the front here. We'll just do it old-fashioned way. Let's go.
Thank you. You ladies are making my heart sing with so much emotion, and I'm grateful. A half comment and a question. Do you think that we can finally get our schools in Africa to put the arts front and center alongside tech so that we stop murdering creativity in our children by forcing them to be little academic giants at the age of 5 and 6 when they should be playing? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. The second thing I would like to know from you is, do you know how important what you do is to the general psychology of the African in today's difficult world? Without a creative outlet, especially for toxic men, yeah, I said that, we don't have a way to balance our humanity. Without the arts, we're beasts. I would love to hear what you have to say.
Was that directed at any particular panelist?
So for many years, I was a school teacher. So I have a few thoughts on that. I think it's an area that we have failed completely, in my country at least. And it's not just art, it's even in many schools in Nigeria, they don't even teach history anymore. So you can't even see what was being created 100 years before. I mean, none of it exists. It's absolutely critical. Whether the government's going to do anything about it, anything that actually is meaningful, I doubt it. Until we get to that point where we can get them to understand the significance of creativity and encouraging creativity in children. But I'm not holding my breath. You know what? I don't care what the government is doing anymore. I'm going to make it happen. It's as simple as that.
I think just to that, as a creator of children's content, I think that is sort of, that is the way. We can't rely on, schools, like you said, history isn't being taught, in schools. The arts are just being sort of blocked out. It's all about academia, and that's it, and sort of stifling creativity. And creating, for us, like creating content, children's animation, and telling our stories through animation and showing children a world and an imagination and adventure and wonder, and sort of getting back to the basics of when, we were kids and had imagination, building a box and pretending that we were in space or, whatever. And I think it's, as creatives, especially creatives in the children's space, and even just as, whether it's as parents, aunties, it's our responsibility, really. We can't rely on schools, government, or anybody else. It's us.
although I may reserve my confidence in our governments with regards to making changes and ensuring, say, art and history is incorporated into the schools, I do know that governments are opportunistic, like parasites. So since they recognize that places like Sharjah, for example, or Dubai have created, I believe there is a new kind of, not just a visa, but they've created new residencies and things that are available for artists from wherever you are in the world, and particularly targeting African artists. I know our government, the mini-me's, will probably now start to pay attention to the arts because somebody else is doing so. Now that's the cynical comment, but the happier comment, the Pollyanna comment will say maybe through conversations with the UNDP and others, a few good government persons might be convinced that actually arts really do matter and history also counts.
Unfortunately, we will have to leave it there. It's been a lively discussion, a very eye-opening discussion, and I hope you all will walk away with a better appreciation of the role of the creatives in the future of Africa Beyond Aid. I'd like to give a big thank you to our panel here. Thank you so much. And please enjoy the rest of your sessions.